first thing I'm going to ask you to do is, can you briefly introduce yourself and tell us what you've done so far and what you're doing now, please?
Thanks, Philip. So my name is Shravani, and I am somebody from India who has done her urban planning as her undergraduate degree. And I did my master's in urban transport. So basically, I'm an urban transport planner. And at the moment, I'm working as a PhD student, a full-time PhD student in Warwick Manufacturing Group, University of Warwick. And I'm again looking at travel behavior, transport choices, well-being, and sustainable policy making. So before that, I was also working for a while in an organization called WRI, World Resources Institute, where I was looking at electric mobility projects in India and a lot of like on-ground projects and also in the policy aspects. And after that, I worked for an organization called Climate Group, where I was the zero emission vehicles advocacy and engagement manager for COP26. So that was my role so far.
Okay, so that gives us a picture of I don't know how you've crammed all that much in, but there you go. Do you want to tell us where you've got, because you've only, this is your first year on your PhD, isn't it?
Yes, this is my first year. So at the moment, what I'm looking at is the relationship between people's transport choices that they make and their impact on their overall well-being. So the idea is that, a lot of countries have now actually included well-being as one of the indicators to measure progress beyond GDP. And countries like UK, US, Australia, Japan have also included all these kind of factors. So UK did it in 2010, and after that, the Office of National Statistics measures like 3-4 indicators. So those indicators are to measure the overall well-being status, personal well-being of a person. So my kind of study wants to research and find out if we include transport as an indicator, will the well-being score change in any way? So that's one part of it. And after that, why I want to achieve is that because now technology is changing so quickly, and it is kind of like difficult for the government and the infrastructure providers to kind of keep up with the pace that they are changing, like in terms of infrastructure policy or incentives, etc. So my idea is that how do people make different kinds of choices in the future with the coming of new technologies, keeping in mind their well-being as well, and giving a systematic toolkit for the policymakers to plan it accordingly in terms of priority. So what do people actually really want? So that's the broad vision of it. So yeah.
Okay, yeah, that sounds really interesting. So the reason that we're interviewing you for CovCan, of course, CovCan is about climate change. It's Coventry Climate Action Network. I mean, how do you think what you do and what you study what's the relationship between that and climate change, just generally?
Mm-hmm. So overall, because I was working as an urban and transport planner, so when it was urban planning, we get to know a lot about how the city functions, basically, right? So it has to do with environment, governance, and transport being one of the factors. And when I was working with the transport planning aspects, like as a transport planner in my master's or say in my job experiences, we always wanted to focus on sustainable transport. In a way, it is leading to reduction of carbon emissions. So now electric mobility is fairly a new term where everybody is focusing on it. But before that, I was working a lot in public sector fleets, like, for example, public transport and buses, and how to move people from taking their own personal vehicles, cars, to a more sustainable transport like buses. And also I focused on a lot on active mobility, which is walking and cycling. I was also partly, for a period of time, the bicycle councillor of my ward, which meant I worked locally with the people to understand what would help them to cycle more often, and then based on their needs, also have a talk with the government to make basic infrastructural needs. So that was one. And the fairly recent one was my role towards COP26, where it was a lot of like research-based advocacy on to give the private and the public sector bodies a fair, good amount of, achievable targets. As to if you make a commitment, then you will be able to have a roadmap. So when the government and the fleet operators does that, it's like a ripple effect that most of the manufacturers are forced to make more cleaner vehicles, or people are forced to, use more cleaner transport. So in a way, that was my effort towards reducing the carbon emissions, or say cleaner mobility. So overall sustainable transport.
And I think you've done something about studying people's travel behaviour and something on behaviour change. I mean, as far as I am aware anyway, what I think is that in order to achieve a reduction in carbon emissions, every individual and every business and every organisation needs to do things differently, and that's behaviour change. Now, talking about individual people's lives, to get them to change their behaviour is a problem, isn't it? So, what have you done regarding studying people's travel behaviour and working on behaviour change?
Right. So it goes a long way back, actually, when I was in my undergraduation. So I did my thesis on understanding the role of aggregated cabs on urban mobility, like, for example, Uber and Ola, all these kind of cabs. So that time in India, 2016, it was a fairly new concept, like shared vehicles, and not many people wanted to use it, or the data was also not very clear because it was just there and the competition was really high. So my attempt was to understand, why do people make all those choices, and if by the coming of all these aggregated cabs have reduced the ridership in the public transport, and then taken away with these new technologies. So I did a lot of like on-ground surveys as well, and asked people, like, why do you actually use these public transport? And why do you actually, want to move to a newer one? So it seems like the travel distance is one of the factors why people would choose any of the modes. So if it is a longer distance and the cost is cheaper, then probably they will use the public transport. But however, if it is a shorter distance and then say it's round the clock availability, so public transport works only like from a certain time to certain time. But if I'm coming from an airport, I have a lot of luggage. So door-to-door connectivity and all those kind of things also made a difference. So that was one. And then after that, I did my master's. And then my dissertation was again on understanding the impact of acquiring travel information from various modes on decision of their travel behavior. So there I found out that yes, access to information is everything. Like if you have a seat availability, what is the weather going to be like, or if there is a parking slot, there's all kinds of information available. However, how do people acquire those travel information is varied from social demographic aspects as well. So like, for example, the elderly group do have smartphones, but not necessarily they use all these apps to, see the travel information. They would rather acquire information from the radio or the TV. And because now the information is also not that legitimate or user friendly, that they are kind of in a stage that, oh, I don't want to learn that. I would just go to the station and book it. Sometimes door-to-door connectivity or network coverage is also one of the factors why people, really don't bother to take on public transport, because you have to walk miles and miles and miles of it. And now I think with the changing times of COVID, there are other factors, like, for example, hygiene, safety, if you want to travel or not. And now because we are almost like digital nomads, right? Like everybody can work from everywhere. So there's no particularly a need to travel. Talking about that, I was also working on understanding, what are, how can we use assets that are already existing rather than putting newer aspects, like, for example, maximum asset utilization. So it seems like services like Airbnb or all these shared cabs do have like a lot of utilization. And now it is kind of easier to achieve because of the kind of demographics changing. It's more about asset usership rather than asset ownership. Like, for example, I wouldn't want to buy a property and then stay there forever, or probably, want to buy a car and stay there forever, because Some studies say that the car only sits in a parking lot for 99% of the time. So you just don't literally use it, right? So might as well use a shared cab and something like that. So that was some of the master's one. And when I was working, I found out in a more like broader level, like stakeholders, like actual citizens, and then there were like policymakers and infrastructure providers. So one was talking from a developing country's perspective, the aspect of say access to information is not quite there. So for example, there is a really well written policy, but people have no idea about it, and then no idea how to acquire all those incentives, etc. So these are also some of the factors that really inspire travel change or behavior.
So the policies, you're talking about government policies or local government or what?
So it was government policies, like for example, at that point of time, India was making a lot of state-based policies for electric vehicles. So how many, what is the vision overall? What is the roadmap? And then for every mode of transport, what kind of incentives and subsidies are we providing in terms of infrastructure or say capital as well?
But they weren't communicating that to the consumers then, no?
So there were a lot of revision in itself as well, because it's like a team effort, right? Like if the government makes a policy or a decision, the people need to be aware and use that services in order to reach that target. So it seems like for various reasons, there was a massive gap in the target. So I wouldn't blame the lack of information as a whole, but there are actually a lot of softer and deeper level problems, especially in developing countries. Like for example, if you want, like I'm a auto rickshaw driver, like from a lower income group, and I have no credit history of finance, like I don't even have a bank account. So how do you go and access that kind of request for incentives achievement, because they would need some kind of documents to prove that you'll be able to pay back or some kind of return or investment, right? So all those kind of things are kind of missing. So it's a lot of unorganized kind of a segment when it goes to like a deeper level of transportation. So overall, broadly, it's great, like public transport and electric vehicles, but then actual usership is kind of hard to achieve because it comes with a lot of problems.
What do you think about the difference in travel priorities between developed and developing countries?
So from a very young age, obviously, I have lived in my entire life in India, so I can tell you so many things about the differences, about how it's changing, and also how it is very deeply rooted in people, and no matter how much you do, it's still going to be there. So basically, when I was, I'll tell you a short story about how I started this, So when I was younger, my parents were working in, like the public sector, and they used to come back home cribbing about, oh my God, there's so much traffic, there's so much infrastructure problem and everything, and I belong to the Northeast, which is was a smaller town, but then with time it grew into a more like bigger business hub. So obviously the load on infrastructure was higher and higher as people's income capacity increased. They bought more and more cars, and the roads were smaller because that was in a hilly terrain. So it's a seismic zone, so there's no scope of expansion as well because we're close to the river. So at that point I was thinking like, oh my God, how can I change this? I'm not a Superman. I need to do something about it. So that's when I got to understand, okay, there is this course I can do, and if I can actually use all these skills to transform these smaller problems, then yeah, I can take care of it. So basically, when I thought about that, it was very simple. But when I got into the business, it was so tricky, because actually it is a very people-centric work, like transport planning and urban planning. Although we work with the policymakers, etc., my idea was to work in a more bottoms-up approach to understand what the people's requirements are. So on the basis of that, what I have always achieved is developed and developing country, 4 things are almost the same, because it's only human, right? Like we are born in different places and different, like ethnicity, that's fine. So for example, cost, trip distance, and then travel time, etc., are almost the same for everybody, like if it is in a cheaper rate. If it is a convenient mode, I would like to travel in a public transport, say. However, there are smaller aspects, like, for example, income, in the demographic factors, and psychological factors as well when it comes to developing countries. Like, for example, India is a very aspirational crowd. Okay, so owning 2, 3 cars seems like, oh my God, he's doing really, really well in life. It's more like a status symbol. So, for example, there are several factors that I'll give you an example of why do people use cars, okay, because that's the most hot topic. Now it's because, there are a lot of societal factors that, yeah, everybody's using it. I need to use it as well. And it's more like a symbol status as well. Then there are also a lot of like psychological factors that, yeah, I mean, I get a different rate of satisfaction than driving. Needs and behavior are also there. Like, why do you drive? Because I like it. That's why. And then there are different kinds of, say, urban sprawl kind of issues as well. Like, people move out from the city centers to different broader areas. So they would like to take a car instead of like a public transport because it is too far, because they can afford it. And there are 2 other really interesting habits, like a habit, which means like a positive kind of a behavior repeatedly becomes a habit, right? So, for example, I'm taking a car and I have no problems with the parking. Nobody finds me because of congestion fee. So I can do it on and on and on and on. So that becomes a habit for me to take the car. And the last one is quite interesting. It's called Common's Dilemma, which means somebody like me, for example, I know everything about transport, how good it is, like how sustainable it is and everything. I can preach it. But then the thing is, okay, if I take a car today, I won't damage the world because the rest of the world is taking care of it, So it's a conflict between individual car use benefit versus public, like the overall problems. Like, for example, everybody's using it and then there'll be a lot of emissions. Then, yeah, there'll be a problem. But then I think everybody's taking care of it, not me. So that is one. Then there are other things as well in terms of fancier aspects like electric vehicles. So there it would be like something called rate of acceptance. Okay, so in the first level of acceptance, aware people would tell like, okay, I think electric vehicles are amazing. I should definitely promote it, and etc., all those kind of things. But then the second level of acceptance is, if I ask you, like, would you like to buy an electric vehicle, then probably they will say like a lot of million reasons, like, okay, maybe this is good for the world but not for me. So it is called a not in my backyard kind of a concept, that, yeah, it is good for the rest of the world but not for me because it is very expensive, I don't have charging infrastructure, and all those kind of things. And there are also like trust issues, factors, and also confidence level, because ICE vehicles like petrol and diesel are more established market. So for example, there is a breakdown in my car, I would know where to go to find a spare part, or there's a secondary market available, or if I want to resell it, or I want to refuel it for an intercity kind of a trip, then I would know where exactly to go, unlike the electric vehicles. So depending on the mode, etc., the acceptance levels changes. But there are other softer aspects in terms of developing countries as well. For example, gender and safety. So women, although in Western countries, research shows that they travel more because they do a lot of multiple trips, like, for example, dropping a child to the bus stand and then doing groceries on the way, then going to work, etc., coming back. And in the other parts of the world, somehow mobility of women are kind of limited because of cultural factors, and they can't really travel a lot. I won't get into more details about it, but then, yeah, that's one. And then safety aspects as well. It's not only about the safety in terms of road accidents, etc., but the mental safety, that if I go out on a street at night, will I be safe to travel alone and come back? So all those kind of things play a massive factor in terms of, deciding what to wear. And cultural differences as well, because here mostly people, because of the climatic conditions and the road conditions, the attire of the people are also in a way which is friendly to cycle and stuff, although UK and Europe are more car-centric places. But for example, China, everybody cycles there. But if you say like, okay, you should do it in your hometown, no matter how much I tried, right? Because that I was a bicycle counselor in my city itself, and I tried motivating people. But imagine my grandmother wearing a sari in a hilly slope, you know, in 38 degrees temperature. She would just die and faint. Nobody would really care about, you know, sustainable transport or climate change. It's about how personally it affects you, to what level, if it is cost effective, cheaper, you can get in time. I think overall those are the things that, you know, takes care, and it's a phase wise thing.